So I want to introduce Emma Marston from the Des Plaines Historical Society. And her program is called City of Roses, Greenhouses in Des Plaines. And here's Emma.
Well, welcome. Thank you guys so much for having me here with you tonight. As mentioned, my name is Emma Marston, and I am the Interpretive Curator at the Des Plaines History Center. And I have for you tonight a just really wonderful story of a major industry in Des Plaines that has all but been disappeared into the mist of time in the last couple of decades. So it's really a great one that we love to share because it was such a major industry. In fact, the title of this, City of Roses, this comes from a promotional pamphlet from 1949. It says, among other things, Roses, excuse me, in the Des Plaines Valley, with the exception of potatoes, practically every known product can be grown, including orchids. Not only is truck farming carried on extensively in this area, but the raising of fine flowers has become such an important business that in this area, more commercial flowers are grown than anywhere else in the United States. Roses and carnations predominate, and statistics show that the production is great enough to entitle the slogan of the City of Roses and Carnations to be adopted by the Chamber of Commerce. And that's not an exaggeration. There's many acres of glass in Des Plaines right around that time. Now, I will say at the top here, I am focusing on Des Plaines. That's the subject of our collection, and most of the archival materials I have access to. However, greenhouse gardening, this was part of a much larger trend within the larger Chicagoland area. And the far north side of the city, many of the suburbs also had these swaths of greenhouses across them as well. So while I will be talking primarily about the ones in the Des Plaines area, I have no doubt that many people will be familiar with many other greenhouses that existed well outside. All right, better? Hey, there we go, much better. Sorry about that. So yes, this is part of a much larger trend in the history of this area. So please, by all means, if you're familiar with greenhouses that I'm not mentioning, I would love to hear about them. This is one of these things that very often, when things don't get written down, they kind of disappear on us. So we're happy to collect as many oral histories and memories as we can while we still can. So it's a little bit of a background. You're going to start seeing greenhouses appearing in the United States, starting right around the 1700s, but they're not going to become really accessible in the way that we see them today until the 19th century. Part of that is just because of advances in technology. As you're going to see with most of the greenhouses I'll be talking about, they are fueled by very large boilers, coal-fired boilers that produce steam that travel throughout these greenhouses. And so in combination with the light coming in through the glass, it's much easier to grow and maintain the necessary level of light and heat within the greenhouse. And Chicago was especially known for a love of flowers. And we have at least one article from the Chicago Tribune in 1881 that says the average annual expenditure for flowers in Chicago is in the neighborhood of the very respectable sum of $175,000. So quite a lot of money just being produced in flowers for tables, cut flowers, all sorts of arrangements. And of course, you need some way to actually get the flowers from the farms to the tables. And so that's where Chicago really shines. Chicago, of course, is a great transportation hub. So there's lots of roads that connect these far off markets in the suburbs to the city. And Des Plaines has a very unique situation. It's kind of this perfect storm of location. It's in a great location close to the city where the flowers can actually get in and out of the markets without losing their freshness. It's right in the middle of farmland already, so there's a lot of really wonderful land as well as people who have the skills to grow the land. And there is also access to multiple rail lines. And those rail lines, again, are going to come in handy for these coal-fired boilers. You need a lot of coal to keep these greenhouses running. So it's kind of the perfect storm. And so here's my illustration to give you an idea of what the greenhouse industry is going to look like. Right now on the screen, we have an image of modern Des Plaines. All right, so that's our comparison point. And here is a map of the same area. It's tilted a bit here, but this is from 1930. And so you're going to see Ballard Road is this long one here on the long side of the Y, leading all the way up onto River Road over here. And in this image, first of all, you can see two major things. First of all, the area, the Des Plaines area, even in 1930, is still very much open farmland. It's not nearly as built up as it would have been today. So there's still just a lot of farming going on within the city limits in that would not be there in just a few decades later. But also, you can see just in this picture, multiple greenhouse areas. And so they're a bit hard to see here. There's one in the far corner down here, that would be the Garland greenhouses. On the other side here, it's the Stanke greenhouses on this side. When we go up the road a bit, the Hopeful and Pesci's greenhouses are right over here, and the Nev family greenhouses are over here. So you're seeing at least 4 or 5 different greenhouses, greenhouse families, all being produced in this one small area. And that's just a fraction of the number of greenhouses that are producing flowers. And it's easiest to see with our friend, the Garland family over here, but these are largely pretty large operations. This is not just a greenhouse tacked on to the back of a farm, although that was sometimes an option. But more and more often, these became these fairly large scale operations. And it's a bit hard to see on the overhead, so we'll go to this version, which is a much clearer version. And you can see here, all these little boxes, those are all these long greenhouse rows. And what makes it easiest to see on the map, and this is what you can look for when you see these overhead maps, you most often will see they look like these long chimneys sticking up, and that is the boiler room that is producing the steam to keep these greenhouses running. And so, as the screen says, just within Des Plaines alone, there were about 40 different greenhouse establishments by 1936. So this is a huge volume of growers of varying sizes just within the city alone. So here's an interior view of the greenhouses. You can get a feel for what they would have looked like inside. The top view here is, top view here is one of my personal favorites because you can see there are rows and rows of chrysanthemums being produced in the greenhouse. And the most interesting thing to me is the long strings that are coming down from the top of the picture. They're actually being tied in place so that the chrysanthemums are going to grow nice and straight to be put into the arrangements. And you can imagine this is quite a lot of man hours already being put into the growing. And in the lower view here is a stereo card of snapdragons. So again, pretty large scale operations that are, again, largely family run. Here's a better look at some of these massive coal-fired boilers. As you can imagine, this was quite an operation, and many families have shared memories with us that it was a full-time job making sure that the fires were properly stoked in the winter, making sure the greenhouses are maintaining that temperature. And you can imagine the sheer numbers of the coal being produced here. By 1935, 18,000 tons of coal were brought here, and that's just for the major, what we call the big, I suppose the big corporate rose growing plants. And so that just covers those guys. There's even more coal needed for the rest of these growers. So a very large scale operation. And that's why it's handy to have access to those train lines. So there's a number of flowers. I mentioned roses and carnations as some of the most popular, hence the name. But these florists are growing pretty much everything else you can imagine. Gardenias, camellias, snapdragons, sweet peas, violets, and even at least one greenhouse that was producing orchids growing right here in Des Plaines. As you can imagine, would have been quite a labor of love to get that going. And so here's a couple pictures again to show you a few different views of the greenhouses. The top stereo card here, that does show some of those orchids I just mentioned. So again, would have been a serious project to get those orchids up and running. And I do want to point out one other thing on this slide here. This bottom one with the text over it, that says the Premier Rose Gardens, Des Plaines, Illinois. And I just want to get that name out there right now because that is going to come up later. They're one of those big rose growing corporations. So, come on there. All right. So there's a lot of different names here. We'll get into a few of the most common ones, at least in the Des Plaines area. One that a lot of people already know about because he is one of the earliest to grow commercial flowers and one of the ones the family said is still active in the floral business would be Dr. John A. Kennecott. He came here in 1837 to what would become the village of Glenview. And if you go there now to the Grove, that is part of what was once the Kennecott family land. They are going to be one of the earliest settlers in this area. And among other things, Dr. Kennecott was very involved in agriculture. He was instrumental in the establishment of the U.S. Department of Agriculture. And in 1881, he and his sons went from building these sort of hobby greenhouses in the yard to creating the Kennecott Brothers Company, a wholesale business that's serving flower farms across the city and the suburbs. And at one time, they're one of more than 30 wholesalers in the Chicago market. What's interesting about this, they're one of the very few, they're still actually in the floral business today. So one of the very few that survived this transition past World War II, which we'll get to in a bit. Other big names, early names, Solomon Garland, which I mentioned, we saw his family farms on the overhead map. He's going to be another fairly early grower starting around 1861. And he is going to have at least 6 large greenhouses just to start with. And he is notable not just because he is one of these early growers, but because many other families would kind of get their start apprenticing with the Garlands. They would go work on the Garland greenhouses, kind of learn the trade, and then go on to establish their own growing businesses once they felt like they understood the ins and outs of things. And the Garlands will also be one of the first flower shops in downtown Ellenwood Street in Des Plaines as well. So that's another outlet, as well as selling to, again, primarily the wholesale markets, with the flowers being trucked directly into the city. So a couple different names here. The Hopeful greenhouses, which in some areas are better known as bushies. That started as early as 1908 and operated until 1966. Again, George Hopeful is one of those that starts learning with the Garland florists, and then eventually establishes the Hopeful greenhouses and floral shops. So you've seen, or will see, a couple different shots throughout the presentation, such as this helpful picture here of the flower shop sign. The picture here, this is the Hopeful family house, and you can see here that not only is this, here's the house, but you can just see in the contrast the greenhouses along the side there. So again, in many cases, these are primarily family-run operations. They may have multiple greenhouses, but not all of them are these big corporations like the Premier Rose Gardens. So a lot of these are just right there as part of the family farm. And this is a great picture of, I believe that's the Hopeful family, standing very proudly next to the family's lemon tree growing in the gardens. Another big name that many people in the area recognize is Pesce's. Fred Pesce immigrates from Luxembourg around 1911. And that in itself is fairly common, especially in Chicago. A lot of these greenhouse growers had connections to Luxembourg. That was just one of the areas they came from. So a lot of Luxembourgers in the city as well. And Pesce's is able to establish over time the florist shop, as well as a greenhouse, grocery, and farm. And again, Pesce's is, I think, possibly the only the one that I know of in the Des Plaines area that is still operational even today. So they were able to make that transition when many other growers were not able to. Oh, we'll talk about Premier in a second. First, I do want to talk about a couple different things here. There's Fred Blazing. He grew florists. A lot of these tended to be specializing in different flowers and in Fred's case, he was a scientific violet grower. So he's able to kind of really focus in on one variety and give that his full attention. Let's see. So Premier Rose Gardens is going to be one of the largest operations that is operating in this area. They also have greenhouses elsewhere in the country, and they're big enough that they're able to not only just focus on their own growing, but also reach out to other growers and help finance their operations. Andrew Benson is a really great example of this. He is the gentleman who started working on orchids in the Des Plaines area. He started off as chief grower at Premier before building his own greenhouses. And this is a pretty serious kind of experimental phase. It took 5 to 7 years for Andrew Benson's orchids to really start blossoming. So, and these flowers had to be cross-pollinated by hand. So there's a lot of work going into this. And quite likely, he wouldn't have been able to do it without the support of Premier bankrolling his operation, as there's no way he would have made a profit even with all of his work going into it. So when we say Premier Rose Garden is big, I want to give you some numbers just to explain how big. They had over 80 acres of land just in Des Plaines. That's 600,000 square feet of glass. That is just a ton of land under glass. And I have a couple maps up here, which I would love for you to take a look at. You can get a much better look at just the size of Premier Rose Gardens on that as compared to some of the others. And there are also some other fairly large operations. Amling Brothers is another big local leader, Croca Brothers, but compared to Premier, they're not even close. Like I said, the Premier Rose Gardens has 600,000 feet under glass. Amling is probably the second biggest with only 200,000 acres under glass. So there's a pretty big difference, even just from that biggest to the second biggest. So Premier by far is one of the biggest growers. And as you can imagine, a lot of folks just were being employed there, which was really a godsend during things like the Great Depression. This was a handy job for a lot of people who would not have otherwise had steady work during that time, especially when they're being paid $11 per week for their greenhouse work. So that just talks about some of the actual growers. However, the greenhouse business is more than just these greenhouses themselves. There's also a lot of related businesses. So you of course have the greenhouses, but someone needs to actually come down and put them together, build them, and especially do repair work. These would still be full glass, and so you can imagine panes are constantly being cracked or damaged in some way. So you need someone who's able to repair your greenhouses as well as build them. You're also going to need deliverers for coal to keep the greenhouses running. And you're also going to need someone to get your greenhouses from the farms to the markets. The one that comes up here, you can see here, it would be Nelson Express. They would pick up flowers. They would come by the farms at 2 in the morning to make sure they have enough time to load everything onto these trucks and then bring them into the city in time for the wholesale markets to open and the fresh flowers to be distributed throughout the city. So these are pretty thankless tasks. A couple others here. That is some greenhouse builders. I believe that is Winnendy and Sons. So you can see they're written on the wagon. And there is a gentleman very bravely doing work repairing the greenhouses, the glass there. And again, these range from family businesses to much bigger operations. The photo in the picture here, this is of Lord and Burnham Company in Des Plaines. They were one of the major manufacturers for greenhouses and greenhouse supplies. And as you can see, they've got quite a full plant going here. So there's a range of different businesses that are supporting this whole industry, but still very important. So we're moving on a little bit in history. You can see the interior of, I believe that's the Bushy Flower Shop. And the peak is pretty much right between World War I and World War II. By the time you reach 1924, millions of roses, 2 million are being grown annually in Des Plaines, as well as thousands of chrysanthemums, and over $1 million just invested into this florist business alone. So this is just a huge amount of the growth and just a huge industry in the area right around the 1920s and 30s. And even during the Depression is not able to really slow down this industry too much. While not as many flowers are being grown, many growers were able to survive by switching out their flower stock for carrots, onions, and other vegetable crops as well. So that would be a way to keep these businesses running even during leaner years. And this is kind of amazing. It's estimated that during these 2 decades between World War I and II, Des Plaines had more combined square feet of greenhouse roses than any area of comparable size in the world. So again, huge amounts of flowers being grown in really this one very small, very specific location. And some pictures, of course, of life within the greenhouses. Although in some ways it's easier to run your farm through a greenhouse than on the open fields, it still requires a lot of work. You can see here, these gentlemen are hard at work in this picture, just bringing new earth into the greenhouses. Every season, new soil and fertilizer needs to be moved into the greenhouse, and the old soil has to be removed. And there's also the year-round work of cutting blooms, removing old plants, and just making sure the flowers are growing properly. And many of these families, of course, would have been very familiar with each other. You can see here, there's a group of, I believe, different families showing off some of their ladies in the greenhouses as a little get together. And we have heard from many Des Plaines residents that maybe even if they were not working in their family's greenhouse, they might be sent down the road to work in a neighbor's or maybe for an uncle and kind of keep that business alive. So there's a lot of family work being used here. I've got a wonderful quote here from Marianne Garland of the Garland family, which kind of illustrates what the experience growing up with these greenhouses would have been like. She says, "We always had flowers in season, like sweet peas, 10-week stock, violets, carnations, and all the spring bulbs. When the season was here, we would bunch flowers until we fell asleep, but our school homework always came first." So we get now to the unfortunate part of this presentation, the decline of these greenhouses. There is a huge amount of these greenhouses, of course, as we've seen, but after World War II, they really kind of start to disappear. You can see that Ameling Brothers, that's one of those big guys that's raised around 1954. And into the 60s and 70s, pretty much all of the other Des Plaines greenhouses followed suit. There's a couple reasons for this. Des Plaines itself is undergoing a massive shift after World War II. It goes from being very much a farming center to a place where industry and commerce is starting to really take hold. This starts with Douglas Aircraft Plant that produced so many planes, and quickly it started bringing in many of these other more industrial businesses. Good for the city, not so much good for the family farms. And around this time, it's not just the greenhouses. We see many family farms that are slowly disappearing and kind of taken over by the rest of the city sprawl. Another big reason is just going to be cost. Greenhouses are not cheap, unfortunately. Of course, it takes money just to get these things set up. It's a lot of money just to have them built, but they also require quite a lot of money just to maintain them. There's glass always cracking. The glass needs to be whitewashed. If weather comes in, your greenhouse might be destroyed by hail or snow. And just making sure they're heated properly with the coal. Remember that amounts of coal we talked about? That can be a very big expense. And if you have multiple acres of land, that's a lot of real estate tax that's going into that as well. So it just becomes less and less profitable to keep these greenhouses going, given the size of many of these businesses. And the other biggest thing is that during World War II, we start seeing these huge transport planes being developed and used. And they start being used for commerce after the war years. And many people realized very quickly it would be easier and cheaper to grow flowers in warm places, Florida, Texas, places that have this nice heat and weather all the way around the year. And they can just be flown in wherever they're needed without sacrificing the freshness that the local greenhouses provide. So again, it just does not become cost effective to keep these greenhouses active when then the flowers can be trucked directly in, or excuse me, flown directly in from other locations. There are a couple left, as I mentioned. I believe Pesci's and Kennecott Brothers are the ones I know of, but there are almost certainly a few others. This is what I have for you. I would love to hear if anyone has any questions or comments that I'd be happy to try and answer. Yes, sir.
I have two questions. I'm interested in where the source for the glass was. Was there a local industry or was it from somewhere else in Chicago? And also, what was the source of the water that they used?
Sure.
Okay.
The water is a pretty easy one. Most of the farmers in that area are probably going to be using water that's coming from the river. We're right on that river, so it's probably going to be the easiest way to do that is to tap into those river sources. The glass, I don't actually know about. I would assume that that's where a lot of these companies are coming in, the related businesses. So probably glaziers in the area that have access to glass, as well as places like Lord and Burnham that are specifically manufacturing large panes of glass that can be slotted into greenhouse systems. Good question, though. Yes, come on up to the mic.
Even though our area is not in Des Plaines, did Meinekes happen to start out with from the premier, let's say, sphere of influence and end up over here on Tui?
I wouldn't be surprised. That's not one I know too much about personally because it's not quite in the area that I've had the most research in. But I would not be surprised that, yeah, it starts with these growers, and again, they're scattered very much around kind of the outer rim of the city. So I would be, if they were not directly tied to Premier and other gardens in some way, I'd imagine that they probably had, were inspired by this and kind of jumped out from that. Yes, sir. Coming up to the mic.
I have two questions. One is the German prisoners of war at Camp Pine.
Yes.
Were they used as laborers in the greenhouses? I know they worked on the farms, potato farms and so forth, but were they used in the greenhouses? That's one question.
Sure.
And second question is Lurvy's, when was that established? That D Road and Dempster.
So we'll answer those in order. As far as I know, you're right. The Camp Pine prisoners of war were used on various farms. I don't have any records. Let's put it this way. I don't have any specific proof that they were used in the greenhouses, but because of the way they were hired out to many of these farms, I would not be surprised if that did happen at some point. I cannot say for certain that that actually did happen, but it is definitely possible considering the way those men were often used by some of the other farmers. As for Lurvy's, I believe Lurvy's came later. I want to say probably 60s or later. So again, it's not quite in the same sphere of influence that most of these greenhouses are coming up in, but again, probably drawing from that same tradition and quite possibly building on things that the Pesci's were already doing, kind of combining the grocery element with also the flower shop and kind of getting that multi-focus element. So it's not just relying on those flowers, which can be, a small margin of profit. Yes, go on up.
Okay, since Des Plaines is known as the City of Roses, was there a particular rose that was more popular than the others?
Oh, that is a question I would love to answer. So there are almost certainly being proprietary, specially grown varieties coming out of places like Premier Rose Gardens and some of the others. Unfortunately, as far as I know, I have not been able to get my hands on the corporate archives for Premier Rose Gardens. I would love to, because I'm sure they'd have a lot more details about the specific varieties that are being grown there. But unfortunately, I've not been able to dig any of that up yet. I'm hoping, and at some point in the future, I'll be able to track that down. Thank you.
There's a question.
Oh, okay.
On the screen to the right.
Let's see, greenhouses along Cumberland, Irving Park, near in Belmont, near Cumberland. They're almost certainly, I don't know if they're connected straight to the ones that are in Des Plaines, but almost certainly, yeah, connected to this larger community of greenhouses around the Chicagoland area. This would have been, a fairly small community, so I'm sure even if they didn't have a direct connection, they probably, you know, everyone knows everyone else. Oh, yes, I've heard of these folks. I've worked with those folks. We've had workers from those. So maybe not directly connected, but certainly part of that ring of growers that would have been located around the Chicago area. Well, all right. Oh, I'm sorry. Go on. Keep please go up to the mic. You got a question.
Do you know why there was such a market for flowers in Chicago? Was it tied to specific immigrant groups, perhaps?
I think the biggest part that Chicago, and I think you see this with a lot of other major cultural centers, there's just a lot of events, you know, wealthy people doing things like luncheons, dinners, parties. And so for all these, you want to really kind of, you know, show off a little bit, get some nice cut flowers to be produced for your party or whatever that is. So I think it's less a direct connection to Chicago itself as just any big city would have a similar flower market. We're just lucky enough that we have access to a lot of really great farmland that's able to really feed that flower mania. Yes, sir, go ahead.
I don't know if you have any information about it, but O'Hare Airport's designation is ORD,
Yes,
which is a short, because it used to be Orchard Field.
Mhm.
There were a lot of orchards in the area. Do you have any information about that, or?
Not as much. So as the name suggests, Orchard Place would have been, it was unincorporated Des Plaines. So we're located right next to us, but not really technically a part of, you know, the city itself. But as the name suggests, I believe what was being grown out there was primarily fruit orchards and things like that, that would not have necessarily been underclass. But yes, that is exactly where the name comes from. So that's always my favorite fun fact about O'Hare. Yeah, please, yeah, keep going to the mic, yes.
Okay, this is not related to flowers, but why don't you tell us a little bit about the Des Plaines History Center and the organization? My wife and I were there yesterday, and it was kind of a cameo visit, but tell us a little bit about it. Maybe how do you get funded? How do you survive? What's your thrust? What do you do, et cetera, et cetera?
So as the name, as you can probably guess from the name, we are the Des Plaines History Center. So our focus is primarily anything having to do with the history of Des Plaines, and to some extent the larger Main Township area, as some of the other surrounding suburbs don't always have their own historical societies to build from. And so we have evolved over time. We are now lucky enough to have our visitor center as well as the beautiful Kinder House that's located right next to it on our property. And that is maintained as a 1907 historic house museum. And so it's actually a really unique piece of property, only ever owned by one Des Plaines family. And so it's a great way to talk about trends that you see in the area, especially in family life around the turn of the century. In addition to that, we do all sorts of different things. There is a rotating exhibit that goes in our main space. Right now, we actually just opened up our latest exhibit, which is all about growing up in Des Plaines. So there's a lot of very cool things ranging from early schools to a couple things that I remember from my childhood, like a Game Boy. So a very fun look at the way children have been living in Des Plaines for many years. We also usually have at least one art exhibit up. We love to focus on our local artists, whether they are part of the art guild in town or maybe pieces that we have in our collection. Specifically, I work a lot with groups in schools. So we try to have a number of programs throughout the year that range on all kinds of topics of historical interest, as well as get out to the schools as much as possible and really make sure we're connecting with the younger generation as well. We are very lucky in some ways. We're able to be funded thanks to money coming from the city of Des Plaines, as well as the Des Plaines Park District and private donors. So between the three of those, we're able to cobble together enough money to maintain a small professional staff of 4 people. So that has been a really, really great thing to have the manpower and the time to be able to pursue research as well as maintain this day-to-day affairs at the museum.
You had mentioned the Kennecott house over in the Grove. did he have greenhouses on that property, or were the Kennecott greenhouses someplace else?
I believe at one point he probably did have a few greenhouses. The Kennecotts, it's actually, once the Kennecott brothers is actually founded, it would be his sons. But Dr. Kennecott, again, great agriculturalist, and so I have no doubt that he probably was playing with a couple different varieties that were underclass as he's kind of developing some of these flower varieties. I believe, if I remember correctly from the last time I was over at the Grove, peonies were their specialty. Peonies.
Thank you for your presentation. It's really, really interesting. You mentioned a little bit about Chicago, and I know our slogan as a city is herbs and orto, which is city and a garden. And I was wondering if the city of Chicago and Des Plaines had any sort of like official partnership when it came to like bringing in flowers or, you know, decorating or anything like that.
I don't know if there's anything so much as official. I think in a lot of ways, you know, there's a lot of people in Chicago that are looking for access to these flowers, and it's more of a case of, hey, there are people who are already growing things. We should make a connection with them. I don't know if it's anything official. There would be, Chicago's kind of interesting because, yeah, you mentioned the motto there. There's quite a bit of, you know, truck farming, other kind of urban farming that's being established in Chicago as well. And what we see in Des Plaines is kind of an outcropping of that. The Chicago gardens and farms tend to be more vegetable focused. There's some really interesting research about vegetables grown on trucks or greenhouses in the city itself. But Des Plaines, again, has this focus on flowers.
There's a railroad tracks that go right through downtown Des Plaines and Northwestern. Does your society have any information on how the railroads were used to distribute flowers from Des Plaines? I mean, not just to Chicago, but maybe to other parts of the country?
A little bit, as you can imagine, yes, the train is a pretty big part of Des Plaines history. That's one of the main reasons why it grew from that farming community to a much larger kind of industrial center. They were definitely used to transport flowers, yes, so not only to Chicago and then kind of spreading out from there. Probably not too far out just because fresh flowers, of course, will wilt over time. So there's a limit to how far you can take these before they start to really lose their freshness. Unfortunately, I don't think I have anything specifically that, you know, concrete evidence that ties it to the railroad production. I definitely know it was used for that, but I cannot. It would be too easy if I had everything right at my fingertips, right?
Anybody on Zoom, please unmute yourself and raise your hand and we'll push that screen.
Oh, do they want to speak first on Zoom?
You're already the mic, go ahead.
Okay. Yeah, my name is Harris. I'm active here at the Norwood Park Historical Society. I'm a board member, and then I'm also active at the Morton Grove Historical Society as well as with NEO. So the Pullman brothers in Morton Grove, we had a number of truck farms and rows greenhouses around Morton Grove, and then Skokie and Evanston, where I currently live. So did Des Plaines have any of the truck farm? I mean, did any of the greenhouse growers have any of their flowers go to the, let's say, the World's Fair in Chicago? I know the Pullman brothers did in 1904. So.
Again, I don't have anything that specifically proves this. So this would be mostly speculation, but I would not be surprised at all if some of those, yeah, made it to some of these big events. Again, these are largely going not to specific buyers. It mostly goes into these wholesale markets, and from there, the trail gets hazier as you have individual buyers. But yeah, I would not be surprised at all if some of those, because of the sheer size of the World's Fair, that if some of these are making their way all the way into that in various forms. And yeah, it's again, it's really fascinating. You have these huge communities. Almost every community in the area kind of has these own greenhouses, and it's one of these things that many people just are not aware of, which is a shame because it is such a major part of a lot of community history.
Unrelated again, but is there any effort by the City of Des Plaines or even your group about saving the molding farm? the remnants of the molding farm or with the family?
Let's see, at this point in time, I mean, we're always open, especially if it's something that we can, relatively small pieces. When it comes to actual full locations like that, as much as we'd love to kind of take them under our wing, our resources are a little limited like that. So we do our best to try and make sure that we have at least oral histories and artifacts from the different areas and things like the molding farm, but we're not always able to actively step in and preserve the property in the ways that we'd like to. Always an option. It's something we do try to keep an eye on, but it's not always possible just because of limitations.
City, not the city, right?
The city will probably go through us in most ways. As far as I know, the city has not really brought this up to us, but it's always possible that they will take an interest. It'd be too easy if the city actually told us things that they would like to try and do. Anyone in Zoom have any questions or?
Anybody on Zoom? You need to unmute yourself.
All right, I will assume that it was a very thorough job and I've covered all imaginable